In the imagination of millions, power has a face, a voice, and a room where decisions are made behind closed doors. And that image has been defined for decades by Vito Corleone. He is calm, restrained, and surrounded by men who would kill or die at his command. A figure who represents the fantasy that control comes from fear, loyalty, and the careful use of violence. This version of power feels understandable, almost comforting, because it follows visible rules. Favors are exchanged, betrayals are punished, and authority is enforced directly. But what if that image is not just incomplete, but deliberately misleading? What if the most powerful Godfather in American history never needed soldiers, never issued threats, and never pulled a trigger in public? What if real control didn't come from the street, but from inside the very system meant to stop crime? This is where the story quietly shifts away from fiction and into something far more unsettling. While Hollywood built its empire on the mythology of the mafia boss, a real man was perfecting a different model of power, one based on political access, institutional protection, and strategic silence. His name was Frank Costello, and unlike the characters inspired by him, he understood that violence attracts attention, and attention invites consequences. Costello didn't want to rule neighborhoods. He wanted to influence elections, shape appointments, and ensure that investigations ended before they ever began. He wasn't feared because he was brutal, but because he was untouchable. This is not a story about who was more ruthless or who made more money. It is a story about two completely different definitions of power, one that needs to be seen to exist, and one that survives precisely because it remains invisible. And by the end, the question will no longer be who the real Godfather was, but why the most dangerous form of power almost never looks like a criminal at all. The enduring power of Vito Corleone comes from how perfectly he fits the story people want to believe about control. That authority is personal, visible, and ultimately moral if exercised with restraint. He sits at the center of a clearly defined hierarchy where loyalty, family, and honor are spoken of as sacred values, and where violence is framed as a last resort rather than a business tool. This structure creates the comforting illusion that power follows rules everyone understands. Rules that feel almost fair in their consistency, because favors are repaid, betrayals are punished, and protection is granted to those who obey. In this myth, the Don is not a criminal exploiting chaos, but a stabilizing force who steps in when institutions fail, filling the vacuum left by weak governments and corrupt officials. His authority appears rational, even ethical, because it is exercised face-to-face, reinforced by reputation, and justified through a personal code that separates him from reckless brutality. Yet this model of power is deeply dependent on visibility. Every relationship must be managed directly, every alliance reaffirmed, and every threat made credible through the possibility of force. The Don's silence is never true silence. It is a pause before action, a calculated calm that only works because everyone knows violence is waiting just beneath the surface. His influence must be constantly demonstrated through meetings, intermediaries, and carefully staged displays of dominance, because the moment that fear fades, so does his control. This is why the myth requires ritual. Weddings, funerals, negotiations in dark rooms, and whispered promises that bind people together through emotion rather than structure. It is a world where power is intensely personal, and therefore fragile, because it lives and dies with the individual who commands it. What makes this myth so persuasive is that it offers clarity. There is a visible enemy, a visible ruler, and visible consequences for crossing the line. The audience is invited to believe that as long as someone like Vito Corleone is in charge, there is order within the chaos. a predictable logic to an otherwise violent world. But that clarity is also its greatest weakness, because it hides a fundamental truth about real power. Anything that must constantly prove itself is already insecure. The cinematic Don survives by managing perception, not systems, and his empire depends on his ability to remain present, respected, and feared at all times. This is why the myth ultimately collapses when confronted with reality. In the real world, power that relies on personal authority and visible enforcement attracts attention from rivals, law enforcement, and the public. It creates pressure, conflict, and eventual exposure. The story of Vito Corleone works because it is fiction, because it simplifies power into something dramatic and human, something that can be admired or condemned. But the moment we move beyond the myth, a far more unsettling question emerges. What happens when power no longer needs to be seen at all? If Vito Corleone represents power that must be seen to be believed, then Frank Costello represents the opposite. Power that works best when no one is looking. Operating at the height of his influence in New York City during the 1930s through the 1950s, Costello rejected the traditional mafia obsession with territory, violence, and street-level dominance. He understood that neighborhoods could be taken away, soldiers could be arrested, and bosses could be killed, but institutions, once influenced, could protect you for decades. Rather than ruling from a visible throne, Costello embedded himself quietly into the political bloodstream of the city, building relationships not with hitmen, but with mayors, judges, police commissioners, and party bosses. His power did not come from fear of retaliation, but from certainty of protection, because people aligned with him knew that the system itself would quietly lean in their favor. Costello's approach was so effective precisely because it avoided spectacle. He preferred bribes over bullets, conversations over confrontations, and access over intimidation, understanding that violence creates headlines while influence creates outcomes. Where other mob figures demanded loyalty through terror, Costello offered something far more valuable: predictability. Cases disappeared before indictments were filed, raids were delayed until evidence went cold, and political rivals found themselves blocked by invisible hands they could never identify. To the public, Costello appeared almost boring, a well-dressed man with no obvious empire, but to those inside the system, his name carried weight because it signaled that decisions had already been made elsewhere. This form of power thrived on silence. There were no dramatic sit-downs, no public displays of authority, and no need to constantly remind others who was in charge. Costello rarely had to give direct orders, because the people around him understood how the machine worked and adjusted their behavior accordingly. In this sense, he did not command loyalty in the emotional way Vito Corleone does. He engineered dependency, ensuring that careers, elections, and legal outcomes were quietly tied to his continued favor. The brilliance of this strategy was that it removed him from the center of conflict, allowing others to fight, fail, and fall while he remained untouched. What makes this model of power so unsettling is how easily it blends into legitimacy. Costello did not challenge the state, he co-opted it, turning democracy's weakest points into personal assets. While fictional mob bosses collapse under the weight of their own visibility, Costello's influence expanded precisely because it was hidden, distributed, and institutionalized. He was not feared in the streets, but respected in offices where decisions were recorded as policy rather than crime. And in that quiet transformation, the idea of the Godfather changed forever, from a man who rules through force to one who controls outcomes without ever needing to appear responsible for them. The true dividing line between myth and reality becomes clear the moment violence enters the equation. In the world of Vito Corleone, violence is a controlled instrument, used sparingly but always visibly. a reminder that authority ultimately rests on the threat of force. Every act of restraint only works because everyone knows what will happen if restraint ends. But in the real world, violence does not stabilize power. It destabilizes it, creating chaos, retaliation, and scrutiny that no empire can survive forever. Frank Costello understood this better than most, which is why he treated violence not as a solution, but as a liability. To him, every gunshot was an alarm bell, every dead body an invitation for attention, and every public conflict a weakness that could be exploited by enemies or prosecutors. This philosophy was put to the ultimate test in 1957, when Costello was shot in the head in the lobby of his apartment building by Vincent Gigante, a rival seeking to seize control through the old rules of intimidation and blood. In a world shaped by the Vito Corleone myth, this moment should have triggered a brutal retaliation, a wave of revenge designed to reassert dominance and restore fear. Instead, Costello did something that shocked the underworld. He walked away. He survived the attack, and rather than escalating the conflict, he quietly retired, allowing others to fight over territory while he preserved what mattered most: his political insulation and long-term safety. That decision revealed a truth far more powerful than any fictional showdown, because only a man whose influence runs deeper than muscle can afford to disappear without consequences. Costello's retreat exposed the fragility of violence-based authority. The men who replaced him inherited power that demanded constant enforcement, endless conflict, and eventual exposure. Costello, meanwhile, retained his wealth, his connections, and his freedom, proving that real power is measured by what you can give up without losing control. His influence did not vanish with his retirement. It lingered quietly in the form of relationships, favors owed, and institutional habits that outlasted his presence. This is the kind of power that cannot be seized with a gun, because it does not reside in a single office or individual, but in the routines of governance itself. The contrast became even clearer during the 1951 televised hearings of the Kefauver Committee. While America watched mobsters squirm under questioning, Costello appeared calm, measured, and largely unbroken by the spectacle. The hearings exposed him, but they did not dismantle him, revealing the limits of public accountability when influence has already penetrated legal and political structures. For the audience, this moment shattered the illusion that exposure equals defeat. Costello did not need to win in court to maintain power. He only needed the system to fail at removing him. This is where the myth of Vito Corleone finally collapses. Fiction teaches us that power is lost through betrayal or violence, but reality shows something far more disturbing. Power ends only when systems are rebuilt, not when individuals fall. Costello survived assassination, scrutiny, and retirement, not because he was feared, but because he had already ensured that fear was unnecessary. In choosing silence over retaliation, invisibility over dominance, he demonstrated the most dangerous lesson of all. The strongest form of control is the one that no longer needs to defend itself. What truly separates Frank Costello from every cinematic version of a mafia boss is not how he operated in the underworld, but how effectively he merged that world with formal political power. Costello did not sit outside the system waiting to corrupt it. He positioned himself inside the networks that already determined who rose, who fell, and which rules were enforced. Through deep connections to Tammany Hall, he gained access to the machinery that controlled elections, appointments, and law enforcement priorities, transforming criminal influence into something far more durable than street control. This was not bribery in the crude sense portrayed in films, but long-term alignment, where politicians understood that their careers advanced more smoothly when Costello's interests were quietly respected. This form of power was revolutionary because it eliminated confrontation entirely. Instead of threatening officials, Costello made himself indispensable to them. offering voter mobilization, financial backing, and strategic coordination that political institutions could not easily replace. Judges found their paths to higher office unobstructed, police commissioners enjoyed stability and support, and prosecutors learned, often without being told, which cases were worth pursuing and which were destined to stall. In this environment, crime did not need to hide from the law because it had already reshaped how the law functioned. Decisions that favored Costello's network were recorded as administrative outcomes, not criminal acts, blurring the line between governance and corruption until the distinction became almost meaningless. This is where the idea of the Godfather takes on its most unsettling form. Vito Corleone rules through personal authority, but Costello influenced systems, and systems do not require loyalty or fear to function. Once embedded, they continue operating automatically, long after the individual who shaped them steps back. Costello understood that a bullet can remove a man, but it cannot remove a process, and that true security comes from being part of how decisions are made, not from commanding those who carry them out. His genius lay in making himself invisible at the moment when visibility would have exposed him, allowing policies, procedures, and political habits to do his work for him. The danger of this model is that it resists accountability. When power is exercised openly, it can be challenged, investigated, and eventually dismantled. But when influence is diffused across institutions, responsibility disappears into committees, offices, and bureaucratic routines. Costello did not need to give orders because the environment he helped shape already produced outcomes aligned with his interests. In that sense, he was no longer merely a criminal figure, but a quiet participant in governance itself, operating in the gray space where legality, legitimacy, and corruption overlap. This is the point where the comparison becomes impossible to ignore. Vito Corleone feels powerful because he dominates his world, but Frank Costello was powerful because he helped define the rules of his. One relied on personal control that died with him. The other cultivated influence that outlived his presence. And in that transition, crime ceased to look like crime at all, becoming something far more dangerous. A silent partner of the state, hidden in plain sight. The final reason Frank Costello could never be portrayed honestly on screen is that his story undermines the very fantasy audiences rely on to make sense of power. Vito Corleone works as a character because his authority is legible. We can see who he controls, how he controls them, and what happens when someone defies him. His world offers emotional clarity, with heroes, villains, betrayals, and consequences that unfold in dramatic scenes. Costello's world offers none of that. There are no decisive confrontations, no cinematic turning points, and no single moment where justice feels served, only a long accumulation of quiet advantages that slowly reshape reality. This makes his power difficult to dramatize, because it does not announce itself, and it leaves behind no obvious villain to defeat. Hollywood avoids this story because it forces an uncomfortable realization. The most effective power structures do not look criminal. Costello did not need to terrorize communities or rule through fear, because his influence was already normalized within respectable institutions. Politicians did not see him as a threat, they saw him as a resource. Law enforcement did not see him as an enemy, they saw him as a complication best avoided. Even public exposure failed to dismantle him, because exposure without structural reform changes nothing. Unlike the fictional Don, Costello did not fall due to betrayal or violence. He simply aged out of visibility, leaving behind a system that continued to function without him. This is why the myth of Vito Corleone remains so appealing. It reassures audiences that power is personal, dramatic, and ultimately vulnerable, that removing the man removes the problem. Costello's story denies that comfort entirely. It suggests that power can survive without a face, without a voice, and without a throne. Embedded instead in routines, incentives, and institutional habits that resist disruption. In this version of reality, there is no cathartic ending, no moment of triumph, only the quiet persistence of influence that adapts and endures. By remaining invisible, Costello achieved something no fictional godfather ever could. He made himself unnecessary to his own empire. When violence failed, when attention grew dangerous, and when the spotlight turned hostile, he stepped back without collapsing the structure he helped build. That is the ultimate difference between myth and reality. Vito Corleone must remain present to rule, but Frank Costello proved that the highest form of power is the one that continues operating long after its architect disappears. By the time the comparison is complete, the distinction becomes impossible to ignore. Vito Corleone represents the version of power we are comfortable watching. Power that is personal, visible, and dramatic enough to feel controllable. His authority depends on presence, reputation, and the constant reinforcement of fear, which means it can be challenged, disrupted, and ultimately destroyed. That is why his story works as cinema, because it offers resolution, punishment, and the illusion that power ends when the man falls. It gives the audience closure. The story of Frank Costello offers no such comfort. His influence did not rely on spectacle or intimidation, but on access, routine, and institutional memory, forces that do not disappear when a single figure steps away. He demonstrated that real control is not exercised through commands, but through environments where outcomes feel inevitable and resistance feels pointless. When violence threatened to expose him, he didn't fight to reclaim the spotlight. He retreated into silence, confident that the system would continue moving in directions he had already shaped. This is why Costello, not the fictional Don, represents the most dangerous form of power. He did not need loyalty, fear, or mythology to survive, only patience and an understanding of how governance truly works. His legacy forces a question that still matters today, far beyond the world of organized crime. How much influence exists around us that never announces itself, never appears on screen, and never asks for permission? Because if power can operate without visibility, then removing individuals is never enough. And the real story is not about who rules, but about how systems quietly decide for us long after the architects are gone.